Welcome to Cheater Confessions. Let's get started with today's story. People say you find out who someone really is when they're angry. I disagree. I think you find out when they stop trying to protect your feelings. That lesson cost me 5 years of marriage. My wife, Kimberly, was the one who planned the weekend. She said we both needed a break from work, bills, and routines. A friend of hers had rented a large cabin beside a lake, and 3 couples were going. At the last minute, her coworker Robert joined because, according to Kimberly, his vacation plans had fallen apart. "He's funny," she told me while we packed the SUV. "You'll like him." "I'll survive either way," I said. She laughed like I'd made a great joke. The cabin was impressive. Big porch, private dock, fire pit overlooking the water. Everyone settled in quickly. Robert fit in almost too easily. He and Kimberly already had little jokes they didn't bother explaining. She laughed louder around him than she had around me in months. I noticed it. I didn't comment. You don't accuse people over instincts. You wait for facts. That night we grilled steaks, played cards, and shared a few bottles of wine. By the time darkness covered the lake, everyone was sitting around the fire with blankets over their shoulders. One of the wives smiled and said, "Let's hear how every couple met." The stories were harmless: college romances, blind dates, terrible first impressions. Then somebody pointed at Kimberly. "Your turn." She smiled, took another sip of wine, and looked straight at me. "Oh, Derek?" she said with a laugh. "He was just temporary." The group chuckled. I didn't. Kimberly kept going before anyone could react. I had just gotten out of this horrible relationship. Then Derek showed up. He was safe, stable, exactly what I needed. She shrugged. For the time. A few uncomfortable laughs circled the fire. She smiled wider. I honestly never thought we'd still be married 5 years later. Nobody spoke. I looked around the fire once. Every face suddenly found the flames more interesting than me. Then I stood. Kimberly frowned. "Where are you going?" I looked her right in the eyes. "I just learned something," I said calmly. "Enjoy the rest of your night." I walked into the cabin without waiting for an answer. As I closed the bedroom door behind me, I wasn't angry. I was finished. I was already loading the SUV when the sun came up. The lake was quiet. Birds were making more noise than the people inside the cabin. I folded chairs, packed coolers, and tied down our bags without rushing. Kimberly finally walked outside wearing sunglasses and holding a mug of coffee. "You're up early," she said. "Trying to beat the traffic?" "I'm ready to leave." She stretched and smiled. "You're still thinking about last night." I shut the tailgate. "I'm thinking about exactly what you said." She sighed like I was making a big deal out of nothing. "Oh, Derek, it was a joke." Before I could answer, Robert stepped onto the porch. He looked between us and gave a nervous laugh. "Come on, man. Kimberly has a crazy sense of humor. Don't let one comment ruin the weekend." I looked directly at him. "I wasn't asking for your opinion." His smile disappeared. Kimberly folded her arms. "Seriously? You're acting like I humiliated you." "You did. It wasn't that serious." "It was serious enough that you meant every word." For the first time, she hesitated. Only for a second. Then she shrugged. "I mean, you weren't exactly the plan back then." There it was. Not an apology. A confirmation. The drive home lasted almost 3 hours. Kimberly filled the silence by talking about work, the cabin, and how everyone wanted to come back next summer. I let her talk. When we finally pulled into our driveway, she grabbed her overnight bag and headed inside like nothing had happened. I carried the rest of the luggage into the garage before walking into the kitchen. She was already making coffee. "So," she said without looking at me, "are you done being upset?" I leaned against the counter. "Were you telling the truth?" She looked up. "What?" "Last night." She rolled her eyes. "Derek, how many times are we going to do this?" "Answer the question." She set her mug down harder than she meant to. "I said you were temporary in the beginning. That's all. But not now." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she crossed her arms. "I stayed, didn't I?" I nodded once. "That's not what I asked." She looked away before saying quietly, "People change." "No," I said. "They usually just stop pretending." She scoffed. "You've become unbelievably insecure." I pushed away from the counter. "No, I just stopped ignoring what was right in front of me." I walked upstairs, grabbed a duffel bag from the closet, and started packing. This time, I wasn't leaving to cool off. I was leaving because I already knew I wasn't coming back. Kimberly stood in the bedroom doorway while I packed. "So, this is really happening?" she asked. "I told you I needed to leave." "For how long?" "I'll let you know." She let out a short laugh. "You'll be back in a couple of days." I zipped the bag. "Don't bet on it." She watched me carry it downstairs, but didn't try to stop me. That told me more than any apology could have. I rented a furnished apartment across town before sunset. It wasn't impressive, but it was clean, quiet, and mine for as long as I needed it. I dropped my bag by the couch, sat down for 5 minutes, then got back up. There was work to do. The next morning, I opened a new bank account. By noon, I had met with a divorce attorney. That afternoon, I changed every password connected to my personal accounts. None of it was dramatic. It was paperwork, signatures, and quiet decisions. I wasn't trying to punish Kimberly. I was protecting myself before emotions had a chance to complicate things. Her first text arrived that evening. She asked if I had settled in and reminded me that we still needed to talk. I replied with one sentence: "I'm fine." Nothing more. The next day she sent another message saying she missed me and hoped I wasn't making a permanent decision over one stupid joke. I didn't argue. There was nothing left to debate. 3 days passed. My attorney had already started preparing the paperwork. Kimberly had no idea. On the fourth morning, I looked around the apartment and realized I had left a few things behind. My father's watch collection, some important documents, a toolbox I'd had since my 20s, things worth retrieving before lawyers became involved. I sent Kimberly a short message saying I'd stop by around lunchtime to collect the rest of my belongings. She never answered. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes she ignored messages for hours. I drove over anyway. As I turned onto our street, something caught my attention. There was a dark pickup truck sitting in my driveway. I slowed down. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to Robert. I shut off my engine, looked at the truck for a few seconds, then smiled to myself. "So," I said quietly. That didn't take long. I stepped out, walked to my front door, and unlocked it with my key. The house was silent. Then I heard laughter coming from the living room. I already knew whose voices they were. I closed the front door behind me without making a sound. The laughter stopped almost immediately. When I turned the corner into the living room, Kimberly and Robert were sitting on the couch with coffee on the table between them. Robert had kicked off his shoes. Kimberly was wearing one of my old sweatshirts. Neither of them looked like they were expecting company. Kimberly stood so fast she nearly knocked over her mug. "Derek?" Robert cleared his throat and got to his feet. "I didn't know you were coming." "I told you I was," I said. Kimberly grabbed her phone from the couch and looked at the screen. I never checked my messages. I'm sure." Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Robert shifted his weight like he wanted to disappear. I looked at him. "You comfortable?" He swallowed. "I can explain." I shook my head. "No, you really can't." Kimberly stepped closer. "It isn't what you're thinking." I looked around the room. 2 coffee mugs, a blanket folded across both their legs, his truck outside. Her hair was still damp. "It looks pretty straightforward." She reached for my arm. "Derek, please." I stepped back before she could touch me. "Don't." Robert finally spoke. Nothing happened. I turned toward him. "You believe that?" His mouth opened. Nothing came out. That was all the answer I needed. I walked past both of them and into the bedroom. Everything I had come for was exactly where I'd left it. I packed my father's watches, the documents, my toolbox, and the last of my clothes into 2 bags. Kimberly followed me the whole time. "You won't even let me explain?" "I already gave you that chance." "This isn't fair." I zipped the final bag. "Neither was calling your husband temporary in front of strangers." Her face tightened. "You're connecting things that aren't connected." "No," I said. "I'm finally connecting the ones that always were." She moved in front of the bedroom door, blocking my path. "So that's it? 5 years gone because Robert came over for coffee?" I looked her straight in the eye. "No," she waited. "I'm ending 5 years because you stopped respecting me a long time ago. The cabin didn't destroy this marriage." I picked up my bags. It exposed it. She didn't move. I leaned slightly toward her. "Either step aside or I'll ask Robert to move you." She stared at me for a long moment. Then she stepped away. I walked past both of them, loaded my bags into my SUV, and drove away without looking in the mirror. Some doors only need to close once. Kimberly waited exactly 4 hours before calling. I watched my phone vibrate across the kitchen counter until it stopped. Then it rang again, and again. By bedtime, she'd called 9 times. The next morning, the messages started. She wrote that we needed to talk because things had gotten out of hand. A few minutes later, she said I had misunderstood what I saw. Then she insisted Robert had only stopped by because she didn't want to be alone in the house. I read every message once. I answered none of them. By the afternoon, her tone changed. She wrote that she was sorry for what she'd said at the cabin. She admitted it was cruel and blamed the wine. She said she never wanted to embarrass me. It was the first apology I'd seen. It came only after I caught her with Robert. That timing mattered. The next evening, she showed up outside my apartment. I saw her through the window before she knocked. When I opened the door, she looked exhausted. "Derek, can we please talk?" "You've got 2 minutes." She nodded quickly. "I made mistakes." "You did. But nothing happened before you left." I said nothing. She took another step. "I swear, Robert and I weren't together while you were living at the house." "You expect me to believe that?" "It's the truth." I folded my arms. "Then explain why he was already comfortable enough to walk into my home barefoot." She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. He'd been helping me." "Helping you with what?" She couldn't answer. Instead, she tried a different direction. "You left me." "I left after you told a group of people I was temporary." It was one sentence. No, it was the truth slipping out. Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to lose my marriage." "You should have thought about that before inviting another man into it." She wiped her face. "So that's really it?" "It was over before I packed my bag. You just didn't know it yet." She looked at me for several seconds, hoping I'd soften. I didn't. Finally, she whispered, "I never thought you'd actually leave." "I know." I reached into my pocket and handed her a business card. "My attorney." She stared at it. "If you need to discuss the divorce, call him." "Derek, I'm done talking." I closed the door gently, not to be dramatic, just because there was nothing left worth saying. The following morning, my attorney called. "The paperwork is ready," he said. I looked out the window at the sunrise. "Good," I answered. "Let's finish it." The divorce moved faster than I expected. Kimberly's attorney tried to slow things down. Mine didn't play games. Every request was answered with documents, dates, and facts. There were no emotional letters, no late-night phone calls, just paperwork. About a month into the process, I ran into Michael, one of the husbands from the cabin weekend. He stopped me outside a coffee shop. "Derek, you got a minute?" I nodded. He looked uncomfortable. "I've been wanting to say something." "Go ahead." He rubbed the back of his neck. "That night around the fire, I should have spoken up." "You didn't?" "I know." "Why?" He sighed. "I think everyone was afraid of making it worse." I gave a small smile. "It couldn't have been worse." He looked down. "There's something else." I waited. I saw Robert and Kimberly together before the trip. That got my attention. They were leaving a restaurant after work. It wasn't proof of anything, but, he paused, they looked like more than coworkers. "You didn't tell me." I convinced myself I was reading too much into it. I nodded once. "It doesn't matter now." "It mattered then." "Maybe." He shook my hand before leaving. "I'm sorry, Derek." "So am I." That conversation confirmed what I already believed. The cabin hadn't started the betrayal. It had simply uncovered it. A couple of months later, the divorce was finalized. 3 signatures, 1 courtroom, 20 minutes. That was all it took to legally end 5 years. I moved into a townhouse closer to my office. I bought new furniture instead of taking the old pieces. A new dining table, a new bed, a new coffee maker. Nothing expensive. Just things that belonged to my next chapter instead of the last one. Through mutual friends, I heard Kimberly and Robert had started dating openly. Apparently, they weren't hiding anymore. A few months later, another friend mentioned they argued constantly. Robert didn't like how often Kimberly checked his phone. Kimberly didn't like how late Robert stayed at work. I wasn't surprised. Trust doesn't magically appear just because 2 dishonest people become exclusive. When people asked if hearing that made me feel better, I always gave the same answer. It doesn't change my life. And it didn't. For the first time in years, my peace no longer depended on what Kimberly was doing. It depended on what I chose to do next. Almost 8 months after the divorce, I saw Kimberly again. It wasn't planned. I was leaving a hardware store on a Saturday morning with a box of tools in my cart when I heard someone call my name. "Derek." I turned around. She looked different. Not because of her clothes or her hair, because she looked tired. The confidence she used to carry everywhere had faded. She walked toward me slowly. "Can we talk for a minute?" "I've got a minute." She glanced toward the parking lot. "I've been thinking about everything." I figured. She took a slow breath. "I owe you an apology." I waited. "I embarrassed you that night at the cabin." "You did." I kept telling myself it was just a joke. "It wasn't." She nodded. "I know that now." For the first time since all of this started, she wasn't arguing. She wasn't blaming me. She wasn't defending herself. She simply looked defeated. "I thought you'd cool off," she admitted. "I thought you'd come home after a few days." "I know. I never believed you'd actually walk away." "I know that too." She looked down at the pavement. "Robert and I aren't together anymore." I shrugged. "That has nothing to do with me." "I know." Another silence settled between us. Then she looked back up. "I threw away a good marriage," I answered honestly. "You threw away a man who respected you." Tears filled her eyes. "I was selfish." "Yes. I hurt you." "You did." "I'd take it back if I could." "I believe you." Hope flashed across her face. It disappeared when I spoke again. "But believing you doesn't change anything." She swallowed. "So, there's really no chance?" "No." She closed her eyes for a second. "I guess I deserve that." "This isn't about what you deserve." She looked confused. "It's about what I deserve." She didn't have an answer for that. I picked up the box of tools and started toward my truck. "Derek." I stopped but didn't turn around. "I'm sorry." This time it sounded real. No excuses, no conditions, just two words. I nodded once. "I accept your apology." She smiled through tears. Then I finished the sentence. "But I'm not coming back." I got into my truck and drove away. When I looked in the rearview mirror, Kimberly was still standing exactly where I'd left her. The difference was, this time I never looked back again. Looking back, people always asked the wrong question. They asked when my marriage ended. They assumed it was the day I found Robert in my house, or the day I moved into my apartment, or the day the judge signed the divorce papers. They were all wrong. My marriage ended beside a fire when Kimberly looked at a circle of smiling faces, looked at me and said I was just temporary. Everything after that was just the paperwork. I never hated her. Hate keeps people connected. I wanted freedom. There's a difference. Over time, I stopped replaying that weekend in my head. I stopped wondering how long Robert had been around. I stopped asking questions that wouldn't improve my future. Some answers don't heal you. They just give your imagination more material. Instead, I focused on building a life that didn't depend on someone else's approval. Work became enjoyable again. I traveled when I wanted to. I spent weekends fishing with my brother instead of sitting through social events I never wanted to attend. I even started saying yes to dates again, but I wasn't looking for someone to fill an empty space. I had already filled it myself. One evening, nearly a year after everything happened, I found an old camping chair while cleaning out my storage unit. It was the same chair I'd carried to the cabin. For a second, I smiled. Not because I missed those days, because I realized they no longer had any power over me. I folded the chair, loaded it into my truck, and drove to a small lake outside the city. I built a fire, sat down, watched the sun disappear behind the water. This time there were no awkward laughs, no lies, no pretending, just silence, the kind that gives you room to breathe. Kimberly once told a group of strangers that I was only temporary. She was wrong. I wasn't the temporary one. I was the constant, the man who showed up, the man who stayed loyal, the man who walked away the moment he realized loyalty wasn't being returned. She lost a husband because she stopped valuing one. I found myself because I finally valued myself. If there's one thing I learned, it's this. A man doesn't protect his peace by winning arguments. He protects it by knowing exactly when to leave. Kimberly thought I'd always be there waiting for her to change. She underestimated the one thing that mattered most. Once I made my decision, I never came back. Thank you for watching.